What does it mean to be the strongest? Throughout the series, we're given 5 completely different depictions of what the strongest means. These depictions fundamentally contradict each other, yet together provide the clearest answer to the central question. So let's break them all down. First up is, of course, Ryomen Sukuna, the strongest sorcerer in history. He represents power in its purest form, a state of being completely unrestrained. He is unbound by any morality, purpose, or consequence. While others are held back by their humanity or their goals or a sense of meaning, Sukuna exists solely for his own pleasure. His existence began in his mother's womb, where he consumed his own twin brother. He was considered a wretch by the world, and therefore lived his early life in isolation. And as Mahito pointed out, part of the reason Sukuna is the way he is rooted in a desire for revenge against the world. In fact, Sukuna himself also confirmed this in chapter 237 by explicitly mentioning that his deep-seated feelings of resentment came from his upbringing. And it makes sense, right? For all we know, Sukuna's only true connection in the Heian era has been Uraume, but Sukuna did not remain merely resentful. He invalidated the world, including humanity itself, and became known as the King of Curses. As the narrator declared in chapter 30, throughout heaven and earth, he alone is the honored one. For Sukuna, only his own pleasure and displeasure exist. He had left his humanity behind. To him, strength is the only indicator of value, social Darwinism if you will. He views the weak as fodder, meant to be chewed up, and their suffering as a natural, almost mathematical consequence of their inferiority. Now, as we saw through Kashimo and Gojo, the level of strength that goes along with being the strongest carries an incomprehensible loneliness. Kashimo lived his entire life isolated by his power, always yearning for a true challenge, and Gojo was not very different in this regard. But Sukuna's response to Kashimo in chapter 238 reveals why he is different than both of them. Sukuna addresses Yorozu's earlier claim that he was lonely and didn't know love. He admits that while he understands the concept of love, he views it as worthless. He doesn't see challengers as a source of loneliness because they don't stand a chance against him. He sees them as people seeking recognition from the pinnacle of strength, and he provides them that recognition by killing them. And because every opponent is unique, the process never gets old for him. Next, I want to bring up why does Sukuna get infuriated by Yuji so much? It's simply because that Yuji is Sukuna's pure opposite, everything that he isn't. While Yuji's strength is collective, empathetic, and rooted in self-sacrifice, Sukuna's is solitary, cruel, and self-centered. Yuji's very existence threatens Sukuna's worldview because Yuji proves that strength can exist alongside humanity, which Sukuna, as the King of Curses, has completely discarded. And as the man who cracked Sukuna's armor of indifference, he actually manages to make him admit defeat. Which is why, in Sukuna's final meeting with Mahito, he confesses that he could have lived differently. He admits defeat and acknowledges that he had 2 chances at life and wasted them both. And he then ends his story with the wish to change how he lived if he ever gets the chance of reincarnation. Ultimately, Sukuna stands out in shonen history because he never sought connection or meaning. He was the purest expression of strength without restraint. And honestly, there's still much more to say about him. And so, we'll keep coming back to him as he comes up while we go through the 4 other depictions of the strongest. Moving on to the second one, we have Gojo Satoru, the strongest sorcerer in the modern era and the pillar of Jujutsu society. His existence serves as the structural foundation in the modern Jujutsu world, yet that very role tethers him to a life of forced solitude. Let me explain. First, how about we address the philosophical bridge between Sukuna and Gojo? They are essentially the 2 diverging paths of Friedrich Nietzsche's Übermensch. The Übermensch, or Overman, is an individual who rises above traditional slave morality, creates their own values, and lives with absolute affirmation of their own will. And while both Gojo and Sukuna have transcended the limitations of humanity, they apply that transcendence in ways that are philosophically diametric. Sukuna represents the Overman in its most raw form. He has completely discarded the concepts of good and evil, which Nietzsche argued were just tools the weak use to restrain the strong. Sukuna's philosophy is simple. He kills, therefore he is. The narrator calls him the Honored One because he refuses to acknowledge any law or morality outside of his own whim. But of course, the sorcerers of his time, those who suffered under his absolute autonomy, call him the Disgraced One. To them, his refusal to participate in the human contract is the ultimate sin. Gojo, on the other hand, is what happens when the Overman retains a sense of social responsibility. He is the strongest, but he chooses to place himself within the hierarchy rather than simply destroying it. He uses his power to protect the weak, even if those weak individuals are the corrupt elders of the Jujutsu world. Both characters have the iconic saying, "Throughout heaven and earth, they alone are the Honored One," attached to them. But the context is everything. For Sukuna, it was a statement of objective fact from the narrator. For Gojo, it was a moment of peak enlightenment during his rebirth after the Toji fight. A realization of his own divinity that he would spend the rest of his life trying to share. He didn't want to be the Honored One alone, so he spent his career trying to foster a generation that could stand beside him. Basically, he attempted to bridge the gap between the Overman and the common man. Gojo's existence is exceptional because his birth alone fundamentally altered the balance of the world, but that exception came at a very human cost. He was rarely, if ever, treated as a person. Throughout the story, Gojo is viewed as a weapon or a win condition, never just as a man. His signature technique, Limitless, is the perfect metaphor of his life. The infinity that surrounds him is a literal and metaphorical barrier that prevents anyone from actually touching him. It symbolizes a total and forced isolation, and for a long time, the only person who ever saw the human behind the technique was Suguru Geto. Their partnership was the only time Gojo felt tethered to the world, but as fate would have it, Gojo's own growth became the catalyst of their own falling out. And after the fight with Toji Fushiguro, Gojo became so powerful that Geto was left behind, and you know the rest. Geto's famous question, "Are you Satoru Gojo because you're the strongest, or are you the strongest because you're Satoru Gojo?" is the ultimate proof of Gojo's exceptional yet lonely existence. Even his best friend, who once stood beside him, eventually stopped seeing the man and started seeing the strongest. In chapter 236, while he is talking to Geto in the afterlife, Gojo uses a metaphor to describe how he is related to Sukuna. He compares the people around him to flowers. He can nurture them, admire them, and watch them bloom, but he can never ask them to truly understand him. You can love a flower, but you can't expect it to understand you. Of course, that's the same chapter as his death, which, as controversial as it was, makes thematic sense. Gojo's death allowed him to finally end an unhappy life of isolation. He found a rival in Sukuna, who could actually stand on the same lonely peak and look him in the eye as an equal. Add this to the fact that his final contribution wasn't a solo victory, but a part of a group effort, and you can see how his death was a genuine release. By weakening the King of Curses for his students to finish the job, he proved that he was no longer Gojo the strongest. It validated his dream for a collective future. This is why his relationship with the next generation is so critical. Gojo saw Yuta, Hikari, Megumi, and the new generation, and especially Yuji, as his successors who'd one day be his equals. Again, this was his attempt to bridge the gap between the Overman and the common man, to dismantle the very idea of the strongest as a solo act. But don't believe whatever Unc Nanami was saying in that same chapter. Moving on to the third depiction, we have the god of lightning Hajime Kashimo, the empty challenger and the strongest sorcerer in the Edo period. He became the strongest of his era, but lived his entire life in a state of perpetual dissatisfaction because his power created an existential vacuum. As a result, he was left to wander through a lifetime of effortless victories and only one desire: to find a single fight that could make his strength finally feel real. Much like Gojo, Kashimo's strength was a wall that prevented him from having a meaningful exchange with another human being. He was so strong that he lived to old age without ever getting the chance to use his cursed technique, Mythical Beast Amber. Naturally, he viewed the strongest as a cursed status and wanted an answer, which is why, when Kenjaku offered him a chance to fight the strongest sorcerer in history, he obliged. Fast forward to the Culling Games, he is incarnated into the modern day, and in the Shinjuku Showdown, he eventually gets to fight Sukuna. This is where, as we talked about in Sukuna's section, he questions him about loneliness and love. See, the reason Kashimo is essential to this narrative is that his death provides an answer to his loneliness and the man who acted as the overman, but hadn't yet self-affirmed. Sukuna is the one who affirms him. He tells Kashimo that seeking recognition or mercy for being strong is a weakness in itself. Instead, to Sukuna, the love Kashimo sought was already there. It was the fight itself. Ultimately, Kashimo dies satisfied because he finally met someone who could understand him. Again, much like Gojo, he could not expect a flower to understand him. He needed Sukuna. That's why, when Sukuna called him greedy for lamenting his solitude, he simply smiled and accepted his death with a satisfied expression on his face. Moving on to the fourth depiction of the strongest, we have the strongest Sumerian, Dabura, the unchallenged peak of the Sumerian race. His strength is so absolute, it creates an unbridgeable gap between him and the rest of his entire people. He was isolated in a realm of effortless supremacy where true connection or even a meaningful fight, much like the others, became impossible. You see, Dabura exists as a strong parallel to Gojo and a neat contrast to Sukuna. His tragedy is rooted the same as Gojo's, specifically the burden of being the strongest and the isolation that comes with it. Just as Gojo had his one and only best friend in Suguru Geto, Dabura had his best friend, Dura. And just as Gojo was forced to kill Geto to maintain the order of the world, Dabura was forced to kill Dura. When the Desconte tribe challenged the Remelian tribe following the death of the chieftain's daughter, the two friends were positioned as the champions of their respective sides. Dabura had no choice. The chief had taken his younger sister hostage with a curse. He had to fight. And because Dabura, much like Gojo, knew no equal when it came to power scaling, he obviously defeated Dura. Then, in a parallel to Gojo leaving Geto's corpse intact, Dabura did not harm Dura's face. He also honored Dura's final request to protect the Remelian tribe. Now, Dabura's unrivaled, incomprehensible strength in comparison to everyone else around him is where the Gojo parallels become most apparent. Unlike Sukuna, who lived in the Golden Age surrounded by powerful sorcerers and curses, Gojo was a modern anomaly. He was feared because there was truly no one to compare him to. And much like how Infinity created a literal space between Gojo and the world, Dabura's calm, emotionally detached personality created a physiological distance between him and everyone else. But if you look closely, Dabura's isolation is arguably more severe than Gojo's or even Sukuna's. Think about it. Teen Gojo had at least one actual equal in Geto, and then Prime Gojo had his students to nurture. Sukuna, on the other hand, finds joy in the challenge. He actively tried to match his opponents to prolong his amusement. We saw this play out with Jogo, with Mahuraga, and throughout the entire Shinjuku gauntlet. Take his fight with Maki for example. Sukuna, being the massive jujutsu nerd that he is, was genuinely fascinated to see how his techniques would fare against Maki, whose very existence denies jujutsu itself. You see, Sukuna always had jujutsu itself to satisfy him. This is also why, unlike Gojo who called Jogo weak, Sukuna called him strong. But then you have Dabura. He was so overwhelmingly powerful that he actually grew to dislike fighting. After all, he'd win without even trying. Dabura was just totally and completely isolated by his own strength, at least until his battle against Maharaga. And I cannot understate how genius it is that the first time Dabura gets hurt, he's genuinely scared for his life. This moment of vulnerability reminds me of Yuji Itadori fighting against the finger bearer. Yuji also cried because he was facing his own mortality for the first time. You don't see that from Gojo or even Sukuna. Of course, that doesn't mean Sukuna was afraid of his death. In chapter 213, he did a Megumi impression to trick Hana because he knew her technique extinguishment had put him in mortal danger. And in chapter 268, he also kept trying to talk Megumi into staying as his vessel. But this is not the same kind of fragile humanity that we saw in Dabura against Maharaga. We're talking about genuine, existential terror. As Dura once pointed out, the only reason Dabura hated fighting was that he never actually fought. Everyone else was just too weak, and although he is considered as the strongest warrior by the Sumerian people, he hasn't actually become a true warrior yet. This is why Dabura had great respect for the indomitable spirit he saw in Dura and then also in Usami. Keep in mind, if it wasn't for Usami's resolve of impressing him, Dabura was fully intent on intending to wipe out the entire Jujutsu staff. Having said all of that, how exactly is Dabura a contrast to Sukuna? Sukuna radiates an unhinged, inhuman aura, while Dabura possesses a quiet, unspoken riz, a calm charm, and a capacity for flirting that hints at a person who genuinely desires human connection. While the narrative portrays him as a threat on the same level as the King of Curses, Dabura is fundamentally a soft-spoken man with zero delusions of grandeur. And while Sukuna's malevolent shrine represents a pure natural descent into death and destruction using the imagery of traditional altar, Dabura's reverse transcendence represents a violent, forced descent back towards life. This contrast is exactly why its imagery references the monument to the revolution of the people of Moslavina, located in Croatia. To give you some context, it's a memorial that commemorates the local uprising against the Ustash, a fascist movement allied with Nazi Germany. The monument's wings symbolize victory, divine protection, and the will to defend those you love, which is reflective to how Dabura is fighting for victory, for his people to exist. Now, Dabura might also be the most talented character in the manga. I mean, without knowing anything about reverse curse technique, he was able to figure it out by just noticing the weird energy on Maharaga's sword. He figured it out on pure intuition. This is a feat of genius that outdoes any other technical jujutsu feat in the entire series. Remember, Gojo wasn't able to figure it out even with the RCT master like Shoko explaining it to him. It wasn't until after Gojo was basically killed by Toji that he figured it out. Yet Dabura, with no idea of Earth's Jujutsu system, was able to understand and work it out on the fly. Overall, Dabura for the longest time played his role without being challenged, but fighting Maharaga for the first time allowed him to understand strength, which led to him tapping into that same transcendent joy that Sukuna and Gojo feel when they are finally pushed to their limits by a true challenge. But you would never see Yuji Itadori enjoying himself like that. To Yuji, the joy of battle is a foreign concept because to him, strength has always been synonymous with sacrifice, not satisfaction. And speaking of Yuji, it's his turn. The fifth and final depiction of the strongest is Yuji Itadori, the perpetual cog of the Jujutsu world and the undisputed strongest sorcerer of all time, far beyond anyone else in the entire series. In the latest chapter of Modulo, despite Mahito going all out, Yuji completely obliterates him without a single sweat, hands in pocket. He is the narrative's final answer to the solitude of strength, but even now in Modulo, as the strongest sorcerer, he is still a cog, and he remains one because he rejects the idea of a solitary peak. Instead, he chooses to be a functional part of a greater whole. It all begins with his grandfather's dying wish: help people so you don't die alone. This one request roots Yuji's entire purpose in the existence of others. In this way, he is very similar to Dabura, who had to honor his best friend's request to protect the Remilian tribe. Of course, fulfilling the wish that Yuji was given was easier said than done. We saw firsthand how Yuji was continuously destroyed by the world. The worst offenders were Mahito, who systemically broke Yuji by what he did to Junpei, and later Nobara, and Nanami, and Sukuna, who used Yuji's own body to carry out the Shibuya massacre. This level of trauma naturally destroyed Yuji's sense of self, but thanks to Todo's intervention, he was able to reach a state of what many call a pseudo-enlightenment. You can see this in his final confrontation with Mahito in the original series, where he calmly tells him, "I am you." In doing so, he admits that he kills curses with the same instinctual, remorseless drive that Mahito uses to kill humans. He completely strips away his ego to focus purely on his role. Then later, during his confrontation with Hakari in chapter 157, we see this sentiment expressed with even more clarity as Yuji calls himself a cog in the Jujutsu's machine that kills curses. This means that he has no value outside of his utility to the world, but as you'd expect, the guilt of a cog is absolute, because a cog doesn't make excuses. This is why, inside Higuruma's deadly sentencing, Yuji willingly took the blame for the entire massacre Sukuna committed in Shibuya. In his mind, if his function was to contain Sukuna and he failed, then the malfunction is his responsibility alone. I want to bring up all these critical moments before we get into the modulo content, because this context is critical. He is, after all, a cog. Let me also point out a very heartbreaking irony regarding Yuji. Think about all of his father figures, his grandpa, Nanami, and even Gojo. They all inadvertently cursed Yuji with their final moments. His grandpa gave him the directive to save others, Nanami left him with "I'll leave the rest to you," and Gojo entrusted him with the future. They all gave him a function to serve, no matter how vague. But you know who didn't curse Yuji? Sukuna. In chapter 268, Yuji genuinely asks Sukuna to come back to him. Yuji tells him that they are the same. Even though Sukuna saw this as an insult, he simply called Yuji by his name and disappeared after declaring he is a curse. Yes, he did not actually curse Yuji with any final words. In fact, you could argue by choosing to fade away without a final directive or a lingering piece of malice, Sukuna was the only one who actually tried to set Yuji free. And then you have Majuro Yuji. But before that, if you go back to 271, there's a flashback where Gojo asks, "Haven't we had enough of Gojo Satoru?" before telling Yuji that he's counting on him. Gojo was talking about his dream of his students surpassing him and carrying on his legacy. But from what we know of the modulo era, Yuji has become a total enigma who cannot be reached by the Jujutsu Society. He talks about cleaning up the mess of his senpai's children instead of stepping in to save them directly. And we also know that he stopped attending funerals after Hana's. Plus, when Yuta's son, Iori, complained that the current generation's power scaling was failing, Yuji simply replied that it doesn't matter. What does that mean? What actually happened to Yuji? The truth is, nothing happened. He's still the same guy. But much like how Gojo once asked if the world has had enough of him, Yuji believes the same. Haven't we had enough of Itadori Yuji? He has become this nigh immortal entity, but he understands that his existence is unnatural, just as unnatural as the way they treated Gojo Satoru, with how they always expected him to clean up the mess. Yuji is also still playing that role, which is why he said he'd clean up the grandkids' mess. Plus, if you pay attention to the art, the shadow from Yuji's hoodie makes him look exactly like Gojo did with his blindfold. This is a visual confirmation of his burden. It's why in chapter 20 of Modulo, he looks up and wonders if this is what Sensei intended for him. He is playing the role of a cog to its logical conclusion. When he uses blood manipulation at the end of chapter 19, he uses it on both of the aliens and the Jujutsu sorcerers in the building, because to a cog, it's not fair to only target one side. He even explicitly stated that he won't let anyone interfere with the four who are currently fighting. This is him keeping it neutral by acting as a balanced gear in the machine. And then we have chapter 21. Here, Yuji is about to play his final role as the cog. As someone pointed out on Twitter, there is a strong parallel to Buddhist mythology. We have Gautama, Jizo, and Maitreya in Gojo, Yuji, and Maru. Gautama is the teacher who brought enlightenment but had to leave the world. That is Gojo, whose birth changed the world. Jizo enters the chat as the traveler who fills the gap as the guardian and vows never to leave for heaven until every soul in hell is saved. Yuji is Jizo. Maitreya is the Buddha of the future who arrives to bring a new era of peace. That's Maru. As we see in chapter 21, the latest chapter at the time of this script, Maru, with Yuji's help, seeks to create a world where cursed spirits are no longer born. This is the mythology playing out word for word. Finally, Yuji's time is up. He has detached himself from the world, and yet he will fulfill his final role as the cog to ensure that this new era begins. You know it's true because that is the reason he has kept Yuki's book, the one his big brother Choso gave him that carried research surrounding the creation of a world where cursed spirits are never born. Finally, Yuji being represented as a cog is the narrative's final answer, because Yuji himself deconstructs the very idea of being the strongest. The reason he told Iori that power scaling and individual strength doesn't matter is because, in the grand scheme of human connection, they literally don't. We see the weight of this in the flashback, where Maki points out that while she gained strength thanks to Mai's sacrifice, not a day goes by where she doesn't wonder if there was another way, a future where she was weak, but Mai was still there. Because after all, the primary message of Jujutsu Kaisen is the rejection of the strongest as a solution. It is a plea to not rely on fatalism or predetermined roles. And Yuji, by being a cog, proves that the machine only works when we move together. And these were the 5 distinct depictions of the strongest in Jujutsu Kaisen. Let me know in the comments if you think I missed anything.